By the end of World War II, the United States was holding more German soldiers than France, and most Americans never knew the scale of it. Nearly 400,000 POWs lived across more than 500 camps stretching from Texas to Massachusetts, fed white bread, real coffee and meat. Their own guards sometimes couldn't get under rationing. Strict compliance with the 1929 Geneva Convention meant prisoners kept their officers, their ranks, their internal chain of command, their control. That single decision would cost lives, not on a battlefield, but inside the wire, where Nazi loyalists built secret courts, hanged men they called traitors, and triggered a hostage crisis that nearly ended with American executions on foreign soil. The ambulance doors open at Camp Papago Park, Arizona, on the afternoon of March 12, 1944. Dust rises off the yard in the dry desert heat. Beyond the fence line, 700 Kriegsmarine prisoners are going about the ordinary business of captivity. Work details, card games, the low murmur of a language none of their American guards speak fluently. Inside the ambulance is a 22-year-old German sailor named Werner Drexler. He has spent the last 8 months as one of the most productive informants in the U.S. Navy's possession, gathering intelligence on U-boat wolfpack tactics for officers who promised in writing that he would never be placed near the men he had betrayed. He believes he is being taken to a hospital ward. Instead, the driver follows standard Army transfer orders and walks him directly into Compound 4, a fenced yard holding 700 captured Kriegsmarine crewmen. Some of them sailed with him on U-118. The gate locks behind him. Within 6 hours, Drechsler is dead, tried by a kangaroo court, and hanged in a shower room. The U.S. Navy had sent 4 letters and made a direct phone call begging the Army not to do exactly this. Nobody intercepted the order in time. An internal Navy memo would later state, with open fury, that the Army's transfer system was killing informants faster than military courts could try their murderers. This is not the story most people associate with German POWs in America. Most assume the camps were a footnote, bored soldiers picking cotton, waiting out the war in mild captivity. The reality is closer to a parallel war fought entirely inside American borders, with its own murders, its own intelligence service, its own secret trials, and its own hostage crisis that came within weeks of ending in a second mass execution, this time of Americans. To understand how Drexler ended up in that yard, you have to go back to a decision made a year earlier, one that had nothing to do with intelligence work at all. In May 1943, the collapse of the Africa Corps in North Africa handed the Allies more than 170,000 prisoners. Britain, already straining under 500,000 captives and brutal rationing, told Washington it couldn't take any more. The U.S. agreed to use its Liberty ships, returning from Europe empty, to ferry up to 30,000 Axis prisoners a month back to American soil. What followed surprised everyone, including the prisoners. Conditioned by years of propaganda promising that America was a starving, decadent failure, German soldiers stepped off Pullman sleeper cars into camps with real beds, swimming access, and meals featuring meat and white bread, luxuries many hadn't seen since before the war. One captured tank gunner reportedly compared his POW camp to a Hilton hotel. A relative of one prisoner later described him breaking down in tears over a loaf of bread, realizing for the first time that Germany could not possibly win. The reason for this treatment was simple and legally non-negotiable. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, and that treaty required prisoners be housed and fed to a standard equal to American troops. It also required something far more consequential, that POWs be allowed to retain their own military rank structure and govern their own internal affairs. That clause is where the system broke, by refusing or failing to separate convinced Nazis from ordinary draftees. The U.S. military effectively handed internal camp authority to whichever German faction was most willing to seize it, and the most ideologically committed officers and NCOs seized it fast. They called their enforcement squads the Roll Commando. Their nighttime visits to suspected dissenters became known among prisoners by a chilling nickname, the Holy Ghost. Anyone caught expressing sympathy for the Americans, criticizing Hitler, or, in one case, simply admiring American jazz music could be marked for a beating or worse. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the Roll Commando went further than Camp Command ever realized. Loyalist NCOs quietly took control of the Central POW Postal Service, screening every letter that passed in or out, not for American censors, but for any line suggesting doubt about the war, doubt about Hitler, or warmth toward the captors. Names flagged that way were compiled into a running hit list. It amounted to a private secret police apparatus operating out of a U.S. Army post office, and for more than a year, nobody outside the wire noticed. On November 4, 1943, at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a German corporal named Johannes Kunze became the first confirmed casualty of this internal terror. Kunze, a disillusioned machinist from Hamburg, had been secretly passing intelligence notes to American camp doctors, exposing the loyalist network running Compound 1. His system worked for months until a newly rotated American doctor, unable to read German, handed one of Kunze's notes to a German medical orderly for translation. The orderly recognized exactly what it was. Within hours, the note reached Sergeant Walter Bayer, the camp's senior Nazi NCO. A kangaroo court convened. Kunze was hunted down and beaten to death in the mess hall by a mob historians estimate at more than 200 men. He was buried in the camp cemetery. Not one fellow prisoner attended. 6 weeks later at Camp Hearn, Texas, a German soldier named Hugo Kraus, who in an odd historical detail spoke German with a thick Brooklyn accent, was bludgeoned with nail-studded boards for expressing pro-American views. In March 1944, the same pattern repeated at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, where Hans Geller was beaten to death by a fellow prisoner named Edgar Menschner. And then came Drechsler 10 days later in the fastest killing of all, 6 hours from arrival to execution. A fifth man, Horst Gunther, was strangled and hanged from a tree at Camp Aiken, South Carolina, on April 6, 1944, staged to resemble suicide. His offense, according to camp records, included publicly admiring American culture. 5 murders, 5 camps, one pattern the U.S. military had allowed to fester for over a year while it focused on agricultural labor output and avoided confronting the internal politics of men it was legally obligated to feed, house, and largely leave alone. But the camps weren't only a story of negligence. At the same moment Nazi enforcers were running underground courts in Oklahoma and Texas, the U.S. military was operating one of the most sophisticated intelligence programs of the entire war, and almost no German prisoner knew it existed. In May 1942, the Military Intelligence Service quietly took over a former farm in Alexandria, Virginia, once owned by George Washington's family. Its official designation was a ghost mailing address, P.O. Box 1142. It officially did not exist. Technically, by withholding notice to the Red Cross about the prisoners held there, the operation violated the very Geneva Convention the rest of the camp system was so scrupulously honoring. Inside, MISY interrogators, many of them young Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany as children, extracted intelligence from captured U-boat officers, Luftwaffe pilots, and rocket scientists without laying a hand on a single prisoner. Every barracks, interrogation room, and recreation area was wired with hidden microphones, monitored around the clock from subterranean listening rooms. Interrogators posed as sympathetic, neutral diplomats, Soviet defectors, or fellow German officers. One former staffer later described the method bluntly: give the prisoners whatever they wanted to get them talking: liquor, company, comfort. The data harvested at Fort Hunt on acoustic torpedoes, jet propulsion, and rocketry would later feed directly into Operation Paperclip and the post-war American space program. It was Drexler's exact line of work before the Army sent him to his death. He'd spent 7 months under the aliases Limer and Brabant, coaxing convoy routes out of newly captured U-boat crews who had no idea he was working for the other side. Misswei's psychological work wasn't the only secret operation hiding inside the camp system. A separate unit, MISX, ran a different kind of deception entirely, smuggling escape tools to Allied airmen trapped behind enemy lines in Europe. Disguised as ordinary humanitarian relief, fake charity parcels carried hidden compasses sewn into uniform buttons, more than 5 million of them manufactured before the war ended. Specially modified Monopoly sets, indistinguishable from the commercial version, concealed real foreign currency and silk escape maps beneath the printed board. Cryptographers under Silvio Bedini, who reportedly arrived at the top-secret facility not in a military jeep, but in a chauffeured limousine, intercepted mail moving in and out of the camps and cracked ciphers based on something as simple as the day of the week a letter was written. In some cases, they composed fake replies, posing as the wives and girlfriends of Allied prisoners, to keep covert communication running without anyone in Europe suspecting it passed through a Virginia farmhouse. A parallel and equally covert effort was underway to fight the ideology itself, not just gather intelligence from it. After press exposés and direct pressure from Eleanor Roosevelt over the coddling of Nazi prisoners, the War Department authorized the Special Projects Division, led by a Scottish-born poet, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, to run a secret re-education campaign. Officially, to dodge Geneva Convention restrictions on indoctrination, it was filed under intellectual diversion. Davison's team screened nearly 18,000 POWs and selected 816 anti-Nazi intellectuals for an isolated facility in Rhode Island nicknamed the Idea Factory. There, prisoners ran printing presses, produced a newspaper called Der Ruf, and studied banned American and German literature. The paper was deliberately sold for 5 cents rather than distributed free. Administrators understood that POWs would distrust anything given away as obvious propaganda. 2 of the program's editors, Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, would go on to found Group 47, the literary movement that shaped the cultural foundation of post-war democratic West Germany. A camp built to manage prisoners ended up training some of the architects of modern German democracy. Davison's approach wasn't universally embraced, even inside his own program. Military psychologists and sociologists argued that handing Walt Whitman to men raised inside the Hitler Youth was naive at best, that breaking a lifetime of totalitarian conditioning required structured behavioral correction, not poetry seminars. Davison, who spoke no German and had no formal background in psychology or European politics, leaned entirely on humanist conviction that literature, art, and open debate could out-argue fascism on its own terms. Historians remain divided on whether he was right. One academic study calls the program an elitist failure that alienated working-class draftees with dense, unapproachable texts. Others point to Group 47 as proof of the opposite, that it succeeded precisely because it abandoned mass conversion and instead built a small, durable vanguard of future democratic leaders. None of this prevented the murders or slowed the reckoning that followed them. By the summer of 1944, the Army had had enough. Investigators, including a young military prosecutor named Leon Jaworski, who decades later would become the special prosecutor in the Watergate scandal, built cases against the killers, often relying on aggressive interrogation tactics, including forcing suspects to wear winter coats and onion-filled gas masks in desert heat to break the Afrika Korps code of silence. It worked. Secret tribunals convicted the men responsible for the deaths of Kunze, Drexler, Geller, Kraus, and Günther. 15 Germans were sentenced to hang. In keeping with the Geneva Convention, Washington formally notified Berlin of the executions. Berlin did not see justice, it saw provocation, and retaliated. On December 29th and 30th, 1944, German military tribunals sentenced 15 American POWs to death on charges that ranged from thin to fabricated. One man had torn down a propaganda poster. Among the condemned was Louis Biagioni, an OSS operative captured behind enemy lines in Italy, valuable enough that Berlin reportedly considered him worth 2 of the German murderers awaiting execution at Fort Leavenworth. One name on the list, Lieutenant James Grayfield, has never been matched to any actual American serviceman. On January 9, 1945, a telegram reached Secretary of War Henry Stimson via Swiss intermediaries, a direct offer. 15 American lives for 15 condemned Germans. Stimson was furious at the moral asymmetry of the proposal, but the State Department pushed back hard, warning that letting 15 American soldiers hang over an abstract legal principle would be a political catastrophe if it ever became public. Stimson halted the Leavenworth executions and authorized negotiation. For 3 months, the fate of 15 Americans hinged on a hostage exchange brokered through neutral Switzerland, while 1,200 miles away in the Arizona desert, an entirely separate drama was already unfolding. On the night of December 23, 1944, while guards were distracted by a Christmas celebration, Captain Jürgen Wattenberg and 24 fellow U-boat officers crawled through a tunnel they had spent months digging beneath a bathhouse at Papago Park, 178 feet long. Its excavated dirt explained away to camp staff as fill for a new volleyball court. It remains the largest Axis prison break in American history. 3 of the escapees had built a collapsible raft, intending to float down the Gila River to the Colorado and on into neutral Mexico. They reached the riverbank and found it completely dry. Most were recaptured within days, in one case undone by something as small as mistaking cartons of chewing gum for ration packs. Wattenberg himself evaded capture for over 5 weeks, hiding in desert caves and slipping into Phoenix at night, before his accent gave him away to a local street cleaner. By April 1945, the hostage standoff that had frozen 15 executions on each side collapsed, not through negotiation, but through the sheer velocity of the war's end. Allied and Soviet forces advanced so fast that the Swiss intermediaries lost telephone contact with Berlin entirely. Germany surrendered weeks later. The 15 American hostages were liberated by advancing troops, never harmed. Washington was free to finish what it had started. President Truman reviewed the German death sentences that summer. For reasons the historical record has never fully explained, he commuted Edgar Menschner's sentence, the man who beat Hans Geller to death, to 20 years of hard labor. The other 14 were not so fortunate. Across 3 dates in the summer of 1945, July 10th, July 14th, and August 25th, they were hanged at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It remains the largest mass execution carried out on American soil in the 20th century. Men who, until the moment the trapdoors opened, insisted they had only ever followed lawful orders under a flag that, by then, no longer existed. Historians still argue about whether justice was fully served. Defense attorneys at the time maintained that the condemned men were soldiers, carrying out what they sincerely believed was a lawful military duty, judging a traitor under the only code of conduct they had ever been trained to follow, not committing premeditated murder. The broader policy question runs deeper still. Did the U.S. military's rigid, by-the-book compliance with the Geneva Convention protect American POWs from German retaliation, as its defenders argue? Or did it hand a year of unchecked authority to armed fanatics inside American borders, as its critics insist? The war ended before that argument was ever fully resolved, and historians still take both sides today. The story might have ended there, a grim closed loop of crime and punishment. But the camps had already produced one more consequence nobody had planned for, and it had nothing to do with Germans at all. Throughout the war, Black American soldiers were routinely assigned to guard and transport the very prisoners who were eating in restaurants those soldiers were barred from entering. In 1944, a black corporal named Rupert Trimmingham wrote a letter to an Army magazine describing exactly that, standing outside a Louisiana train depot in the rain, while German POWs were served warm meals inside the whites-only counter. He asked a single question that the Army magazine printed verbatim: whether he and men like him weren't also American soldiers, sworn to fight and die for their country. The letter spread. A black Army nurse filed a separate, similarly damning complaint that same year after enduring racial slurs from a German patient she was assigned to treat. The contradiction, enemy combatants treated with more dignity than American citizens in uniform, became impossible for the military to ignore, and it fed directly into the political pressure that led President Truman to sign Executive Order 9981 in 1948, formally desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. So return for a moment to that ambulance at Papago Park. Werner Drexler believed, right up until the gate locked behind him, that the system that recruited him would also protect him. It didn't, not because anyone wanted him dead, but because two branches of the same military couldn't move a piece of paper fast enough to stop a transfer order. His death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the visible edge of a system built on a humane legal principle, the Geneva Convention, that, applied without nuance, briefly let the most fanatical men in the German military run their own prisons inside the United States. The same legal framework that got Drechsler killed also protected the Jewish interrogators who broke Nazi officers without raising a hand, and the American hostages who came home alive instead of facing a Berlin firing squad over a torn poster. It is the same paradox running in both directions for the same reason. The 14 men hanged at Fort Leavenworth lie in graves that, by law, are marked the same as any other military burial. No swastikas, no special distinction, just rows of stone in a Kansas cemetery, the last physical trace of a war that, for one stretch of American history, was fought less with bullets than with bread, barbed wire, and the law itself.